The afternoon sun baked the red earth of Red Rock until the air itself shimmered. Dust rose like ghosts as townsfolk gathered outside the sheriff's office, murmuring with curiosity and anticipation. A rare thing was happening that day. Justice had been served, and the man responsible stood silent at the center of it all. Luke Tanner, the drifter-turned hero who'd taken down the Carter gang. The Carter boys had been terrorizing ranchers for months, stealing cattle, burning barns, and leaving fear in their wake. It was Luke who tracked them across the mesa and brought them in, alive but broken. He didn't brag about it, didn't even stay for the sheriff's praise. He'd just stood there, hat low, dust on his boots, ready to ride on. But Sheriff Amos had other plans. The sheriff, a big man with a booming voice and a good heart, raised his hand for quiet. "This man," he announced, nodding toward Luke, "saved Red Rock from ruin. He's earned more than a handshake. He's earned the town's gratitude." The crowd clapped politely, some out of genuine respect, others because it was expected. Luke shifted, uncomfortable under the attention. He'd never done it for reward. But Amos wasn't finished. "In this town," the sheriff went on, "we believe in rebuilding what was lost. Too many widows, too many good women left without a future after the raids. So I'll say this plain, Luke Tanner, you've earned your pick of any bride in Red Rock. Choose your partner, son. Any woman here? The good Lord knows you deserve a home again." The words fell like a hammer. The women gasped. The men glanced around awkwardly. It wasn't an order, it was a strange kind of honor. But it hung in the air like a test. Luke's head lifted slowly, eyes scanning the faces before him. There was Lila May, all curls and perfume, smiling wide and fluttering her lashes. There was Ruth Carter, the baker's daughter, pretending not to care but standing a little taller. Other women leaned forward, expectant, whispering his name. After all, Luke Tanner was a man of quiet strength, a cowboy's cowboy. Broad-shouldered, scarred, but handsome in that hard, lonesome way. But Luke wasn't looking at them. His gaze wandered past the eager smiles, past the row of polished shoes and lace gloves, toward the edge of the crowd, where someone stood half-hidden behind the hitching post. A woman in a faded blue dress, her hands clasped tightly before her, Clara Hayes. She wasn't beautiful in the way the others were. Her hair was simple, her dress plain, her eyes large and uncertain. Most folks barely noticed her at all. She was the seamstress who worked behind closed doors, fixing other women's gowns but never wearing one of her own. The kind of woman the world forgot. Luke's eyes lingered. Something flickered there, recognition maybe. Not of her face, but of her loneliness. The crowd began to stir. Someone laughed. "Come on, Tanner, make your choice," another man called out. "Don't keep the ladies waiting." Luke adjusted his hat, his expression unreadable. Then, to everyone's surprise, he spoke. "Her," he said quietly, voice steady as stone. "The one by the post." Every head turned toward Clara Hayes. She froze, color draining from her face. Me, she stammered, hardly believing it. Luke nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." Silence swept over the street. Even the sheriff blinked in surprise before clearing his throat. "You're sure, son? That's your choice?" Luke's answer was simple. "I don't change my mind." And just like that, the crowd erupted into whispers, shock, disbelief, mockery. The sheriff shrugged, scratching his beard. "Well then, so be it." As the people dispersed, Clara stood trembling, too stunned to move. Luke walked past her, pausing just long enough to tip his hat. "Ma'am," he said softly, before mounting his horse and riding toward the setting sun. No one knew why he'd chosen her, not even Clara, but that single decision would change both their lives and the town of Red Rock forever. Clara. Hayes had long ago learned how to disappear. She wasn't born invisible, just made that way by years of being overlooked. After her parents died of fever when she was 16, she'd been left with a rundown shack on the edge of town and a single skill: sewing. Her mother had taught her before she passed how to turn rags into beauty, how to let thread and needle speak where words could not. And so Clara sewed, quietly, dutifully, endlessly. The women of Red Rock would bring her their gowns, lace to be mended, ribbons to be pressed, hems to be adjusted. They spoke over her, not to her, gossiping about dances and suitors while she bent her head over their fabric. They'd never seen how her fingers trembled when she handed back their dresses, or how her smile, small and careful, was rarely returned. To them, she was useful. Not worth knowing. When the sheriff's words echoed through the crowd that day, "Pick any bride you want," Clara hadn't even thought to look up. That sort of thing wasn't meant for her. Men didn't look her way. She had accepted that truth long ago. She wasn't ugly, but she wasn't shining either. She didn't flirt, didn't dance, didn't laugh loudly in saloons. Her voice was soft, and her eyes often downcast. And so when Luke Tanner's gaze fell upon her, she thought he must be looking past her. Perhaps at someone behind, but no. He was looking straight at her. Her heart kicked painfully in her chest. Her throat tightened as heat rushed to her cheeks. Around her, women gasped, whispering her name with disbelief and mockery. "Her?" someone said, half laughing. "She can't even hold a man's stare," another added. Clara wanted to melt into the ground. She'd never asked for notice, never wanted to stand in the middle of everyone's judgment. She felt the weight of every eye in town pressing down on her as Luke said it again, firm and calm. Her. After the crowd dispersed, she stood there, unmoving. The world felt unreal. The wind tugged at her dress, carrying whispers she didn't want to hear. Her hands trembled so badly she had to clutch her sewing bag to keep them still. Why her? She didn't know Luke Tanner, not really. She'd seen him in passing, riding into town with that faraway look men got when they'd seen too much. He was polite, quiet, the kind who nodded instead of talking. Rumor said he'd fought in the border wars, lost family, carried ghosts. To Clara, he was just another stranger who'd never once glanced her way. Until now. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, the sound of crickets echoing through her tiny home. The idea of marriage, of being chosen, felt both terrifying and unreal. Men didn't choose women like her. They chose laughter, beauty, and flirtation, not silence and shy smiles. Maybe it was pity, she thought bitterly. Maybe he just wanted someone who wouldn't argue. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks, though she couldn't quite explain why. She wasn't in love with Luke Tanner, but his choice had stirred something buried deep, something she'd long forgotten how to feel, the hope of being seen. For years, Clara had stitched wedding gowns for others, measuring joy in the inches of silk she hemmed. She'd heard brides giggle about flowers and husbands and honeymoons while she sat quietly, mending the dreams of others. Never her own, but now there was a ring waiting to be placed on her finger. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't trust it, not yet. Still, when dawn came and the church bell rang in the distance, Clara rose, dressed in her best blue calico, and looked at herself in the small cracked mirror above her washstand. Her reflection was plain, but her eyes were alive with something new. Fear. Yes, but also courage. Maybe, just maybe. This was the beginning of something she'd never dared to imagine, a life where someone finally saw her. By sunrise the next day, Red Rock was alive with gossip. The sheriff's reward had turned into a story that spread faster than wildfire. Everywhere Clara Hayes went, whispers followed like shadows. "The cowboy must be touched in the head," muttered Mrs. Pickens at the bakery. "Maybe he lost a bet," Lila May laughed, pretending sympathy. Poor Luke Tanner, saddled with a mouse of a woman. The town loved a spectacle, and Luke's decision gave them one. Red Rock was small enough that every glance, every rumor traveled door to door before noon. Clara could feel it in every step she took, eyes following, mouths curling in half-hidden smirks. She didn't blame Luke, not really. She didn't even understand why he had chosen her. But the weight of being chosen publicly made her the center of a storm she never asked for. She tried to stay inside her sewing room, working through orders to avoid the stares. Still, customers came not for dresses, but for curiosity. "So," Mrs. Barton began one morning, pretending to examine a roll of lace. "What's it like, being the future Mrs. Tanner? He's quite the man, isn't he?" Clara looked down at her sewing. "He's quiet," Mrs. Barton grinned. "Quiet, sure, but handsome." "You must be thrilled." Clara forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The woman left laughing, whispering to her friend the moment the door closed. That night, Clara sat by her oil lamp, stitching alone. The soft flicker of light made shadows dance across her walls. She could still hear the snickers in her mind, the cruel tone behind every "bless your heart." But underneath the humiliation was confusion, and something deeper she couldn't name. Luke Tanner hadn't come to call on her since the sheriff's announcement. He hadn't written. He hadn't even sent word. The town said she should feel lucky, but all she felt was uncertainty. Then, on the third day, a knock sounded at her door. When she opened it, Luke stood there, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable as a man could be. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes held the same quiet steadiness she remembered. "Miss Hayes," he said, voice low and polite. "I came to apologize for the stir I caused." Clara's fingers tightened on the doorframe. You don't owe me that, Mr. Tanner." "I do," he replied. "Didn't mean for you to be treated unkindly. He stopped, searching for the right words. "You seemed like someone who wouldn't laugh at a man's scars." Clara blinked. "Scars?" He tilted his head slightly, his gaze drifting away. "We all carry 'em. Some on the skin, some under it. I reckoned maybe you'd understand both kinds." She didn't know what to say. He tipped his hat, muttered a quiet "evening, ma'am," and walked away, leaving her heart pounding in the doorway. By the next morning, the whispers had only grown sharper. "He's pitying her," someone said outside the general store. "That's all it is." Clara tried to keep her head high, but it was hard. Every insult landed like a needle prick, small but steady, stitching pain into her spirit. And yet, a strange kind of pride began to rise in her, too. Because Luke Tanner had looked at her and seen something others hadn't. He hadn't mocked her. He hadn't tried to charm her. He had seen her. And whether his reasons were kindness or something else, it was the first time anyone had treated her as more than a shadow. That night, as she lay awake, listening to the coyotes cry beyond the hills, Clara whispered into the dark, "Why me?" But the question no longer came from fear. It came from hope. Hope that maybe this strange, quiet cowboy had chosen her not out of pity, but because he saw something worth choosing. The wedding came quietly, as if even the town didn't quite believe it would happen. The morning sun poured through the church windows, striking dust motes that floated like golden ash. The preacher, old Reverend Cook, cleared his throat as Luke Tanner and Clara Hayes stood before him, two people who barely knew each other, bound by a promise that neither had expected to make. Clara's dress wasn't white. She didn't own anything that fine. She'd sewn herself a simple cream gown, its hem trimmed with leftover lace from someone else's wedding. Her hands trembled as she held the small bouquet the sheriff's wife had given her. Her voice barely rose above a whisper when she repeated the vows, her eyes fixed on the wooden floorboards instead of her groom. Luke stood beside her, tall and still as a post. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, deep and calm, though his jaw tightened when the preacher said, "Until death do you part?" He answered, "I do," like it was a vow he'd already lived through once. When Reverend Cook pronounced them man and wife, the church was silent. No applause, no cheers. Just the faint creak of pews as people shifted, whispering to one another. Lila Mae smirked behind her hand. A few women rolled their eyes. The sheriff gave Luke a hearty pat on the back and muttered, "You sure this is what you want, son?" Luke only nodded. "It is." After the ceremony, Clara followed her new husband to his horse-drawn wagon, clutching her small suitcase. She didn't look back at the town. She didn't want to see their faces. Luke helped her into the seat without a word. The silence between them was thick but not cruel. The ride to his ranch took an hour. The land opened wide, miles of golden grass and broken fences, the sky endless and bright. The Tanner Ranch sat on the far edge of the valley, a modest house with weathered boards and a porch that creaked when the wind passed through. "This'll be your home now," Luke said quietly as they stopped. "It ain't much, but it's honest." Clara stepped down, taking in the smell of hay and sage. The place was lonely, but it had a kind of peace she hadn't known in years. Inside, the house was simple, one main room with a stove, a rough-hewn table, and 2 chairs. There were signs of a woman who had once lived there, a faded curtain, a small carved horse on the mantel. Clara felt her chest tighten. Luke noticed. "My late wife made those," he said after a moment, his tone careful. "She passed a long time ago." Clara nodded, unsure if she should speak. Instead, she quietly began to unpack, folding her dresses into a chest, smoothing the sheets on the small bed they'd now share. That first night, the silence felt heavy. Luke slept on a cot near the window, giving her the bed. "You'll rest better there," he said simply. She wanted to argue, to say they were married now, but the words caught in her throat. He was kind but distant, his pain tucked away like a secret he refused to share. Days turned into weeks. Clara filled the house with the small sounds of living, baking bread, hanging laundry, humming softly as she mended his shirts. Luke worked from dawn to dusk, repairing fences, tending cattle, and speaking little. But he always came home, and though he said little at supper, he listened when she spoke, about the weather, the sewing, the little things that made her feel alive again. Each evening, after supper, they sat on the porch in silence, watching the sun drop behind the hills. Sometimes their hands brushed as they shared coffee. Neither pulled away. They were still strangers. But in that quiet, something fragile began to take root, a trust born not of passion, but of presence. And while Red Rock whispered that their marriage was a mistake, Clara began to wonder if maybe mistakes could still grow into something beautiful. Luke Tanner was a man of few words, and even fewer smiles. To most of Red Rock, he was just another cowboy who'd seen too much, a drifter with a steady hand and a haunted look in his eyes. But to Clara, who now shared his roof, those silences had shapes. She could feel them in the way he lingered at the edge of the porch at dusk, staring toward the far hills. She could hear them in the way he breathed, steady but heavy, like each breath cost him something. He never spoke of his past, not directly. Yet his life was written in scars. A thin line ran along his jaw where a bullet had grazed him. Another crossed the back of his hand, old and pale. When she asked just once how it happened, he only said, "Long time ago," and changed the subject. Still, there were small signs that told the story he wouldn't share. In the corner of his cabin stood a wooden chest, its lid always closed, its lock always fastened. Some nights when Clara thought he'd gone to bed, she'd hear it creak open softly, followed by a sound that chilled her, a muffled sob, quickly swallowed. She never asked about the chest again. One evening, after a long day mending the fence line, Luke came in later than usual. His shirt was torn, a gash along his arm bleeding through the sleeve. Clara gasped and hurried to him, fetching the basin of water before he could protest. "It's nothing," he muttered. But he didn't stop her. She cleaned the wound with trembling hands, her breath catching every time he winced. Up close, she could see the exhaustion in his face, the fine lines around his eyes, the shadows that never lifted. When she finished, she tied the bandage neatly and looked up at him. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said softly. Luke's gaze flicked to her, startled. "Carry what?" "Whatever it is that keeps you awake at night," she whispered. He didn't answer, just turned away and poured himself a glass of whiskey, staring at the wall. Later that night, when the moon was high and silver light crept through the window, Luke sat at the table alone. The chest stood open beside him. Inside were 2 worn items, a woman's locket and a child's small wooden toy horse. He picked up the horse, thumb tracing its chipped edge. "My family," he whispered to the empty room. "I should have been there." 3 years earlier, he'd left his wife and son behind to work a cattle job across the border. Raiders struck while he was gone. By the time he rode back, there was nothing left but ashes and a single grave marker. The guilt had followed him ever since, settling in his bones like a sickness. He'd buried his heart that day and vowed never to love again. But something about Clara's gentleness had begun to stir what he thought was long dead. In the days that followed, she noticed small changes. He started coming home earlier. He began fixing things she didn't ask for, the loose porch board, the broken cupboard latch. Sometimes, when she hummed while cooking, he'd pause in the doorway, a faint smile tugging at his lips before he turned away quickly. One night, he found her sitting by the fire, sewing a patch on one of his old shirts. The glow lit her face softly, and something inside him shifted. "Clara," he said quietly. She looked up. "Thank you. For staying," she blinked, surprised. "It's my home now, isn't it?" He nodded, the firelight catching the glimmer of something in his eyes, something almost like peace. For the first time in years, Luke Tanner slept through the night without waking to the sound of ghosts. And in the stillness before dawn, Clara realized she was beginning to understand the man she'd married, not through words, but through the quiet places where love begins to grow. By midsummer, word of the Tanner marriage had spread through every porch, parlor, and pew in Red Rock. What had begun as gossip turned mean. People said Luke Tanner had married out of pity, that his war scars had clouded his judgment. Others whispered that Clara Hayes must have trapped him somehow. No one said it to her face, not at first, but Red Rock had its own ways of cutting deep without ever drawing blood. Clara felt it every time she went to town. The first time, she'd gone for sugar and flour, dressed as neatly as she could in a pale blue dress she'd sewn herself. She walked with her chin lifted, telling herself she belonged there as much as anyone. But when she stepped into the mercantile, the room fell quiet. Behind the counter, Mrs. Whitcomb offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, if it isn't Mrs. Tanner," she said, her tone sugared but sharp. "I hardly recognized you. Married life must agree with you." Clara forced a polite smile. "Thank you, ma'am. I just need some sugar and coffee beans." As she waited, she heard the whispers, not even hushed. "Heard he sleeps in the barn," one woman murmured. "Poor thing doesn't know he'll ride off soon," another replied. Clara's face burned. When she paid, Mrs. Whitcomb gave her the wrong change, and when Clara timidly pointed it out, the woman smirked. "Oh, I'm sure you're mistaken, dear." Clara didn't argue. She just nodded, gathered her bundle, and left. But as she stepped outside, a group of children pointed and laughed. "That's the charity bride," one shouted. Another mimicked her shy walk. She hurried down the street, tears stinging her eyes. She thought of Luke, how he'd told her to send him a list if she ever needed supplies. But she didn't want to burden him. He worked hard, and she didn't want to be another thing he had to defend. Still, when she returned home, her silence gave her away. Luke noticed the way her shoulders sagged, the way her hands trembled slightly as she unpacked the groceries. "Something happened in town?" he asked, voice low. Clara hesitated. "No, not really. Just people talk, that's all." Luke leaned back in his chair, jaw tightening. "What did they say?" "Nothing that matters," she whispered. But it mattered to him. The next morning, Luke saddled his horse and rode into town alone. By noon, everyone knew. It happened outside the general store. A ranch hand named Tom Barlow, a loud, whiskey-soaked man, had been bragging to his friends that Tanner only married that plain girl because no one else would have him. Luke stepped out from behind him and said, "Say that again." Tom turned, grinning. "Didn't mean no harm, Luke. Just having fun." Luke's voice was calm. "You don't speak her name again. Understand?" When Tom laughed, Luke's fist met his jaw. The man fell into the dust, stunned, silent. Luke didn't hit him again. He just stood there, voice cold as iron. "You mock my wife, you mock me. And I don't take kindly to that. No one in town forgot it." That night, when Clara heard what had happened, she didn't know whether to be angry or grateful. But when Luke came home, dirt still on his boots and a bruise forming on his knuckle, he only said, "They'll think twice before talking again." Clara looked at him for a long time. Then softly she said, "You didn't have to fight for me." He met her gaze. "Wasn't a fight," he said simply. It was truth. "You're my wife. That's worth standing up for." Something warm broke loose in her chest. For the first time since her wedding day, she smiled, a small, trembling smile that reached her eyes. From that day forward, Red Rock still whispered, but quieter now. Because when Luke Tanner spoke, people listened, and when he said Clara was his wife, they finally believed it. Autumn came early that year, carried on a wind that howled across the plains like a restless spirit. The skies over Red Rock turned gray for days, thick with the promise of rain. When the storm finally broke, it came with a vengeance, thunder rolling like cannon fire, wind tearing across the valley, and sheets of water so heavy they blurred the horizon. Luke Tanner was out in it. He'd ridden that morning to help his neighbor, old Ben Hargreaves, whose cattle had broken loose near the creek. Clara had begged him not to go. "The storm's coming," she warned, standing in the doorway, rain already tapping the roof. "I'll be back before it hits," Luke said, giving her that small, quiet smile she'd come to know so well. Ben's got no one else. But the storm came faster than anyone expected. Hours passed. The light dimmed to near darkness, and the wind shrieked through the trees. Clara lit every lamp in the house, trying to calm herself with busy hands, boiling water, mending a shirt, praying under her breath. But as the thunder grew louder and the roof began to rattle, her heart wouldn't settle. By nightfall, Luke still hadn't returned. Clara's mind filled with every terrible image she could imagine. His horse spooked by lightning, the creek flooding, his body trapped somewhere in the mud. At last, she couldn't stand it any longer. She grabbed her shawl, saddled her mare, and rode out into the storm. Rain lashed her face, blinding her. The wind tore at her skirts and soaked her through in minutes, but she pressed on. The road was nearly invisible, a blur of mud and water. Every few moments she called his name, her voice swallowed by the roar of the storm. At the edge of the creek she found his horse, riderless, reins tangled in a branch. Her heart stopped. "Luke!" she cried, voice breaking. Then she saw him, 100 feet away, pinned beneath a fallen tree limb, his leg twisted, mud streaked across his face. "Clara!" he shouted hoarsely as she ran to him. "You shouldn't have come." But she was already on her knees beside him, trying to lift the branch. It was too heavy, the rain making it slick. Tears mixed with the water on her cheeks. "Hold on," she whispered, bracing her shoulder against the wood. With a cry, she pushed, using every bit of strength she had. Inch by inch, the limbs shifted until Luke managed to drag himself free, gasping with pain. They half stumbled, half crawled back to her horse. She helped him into the saddle and walked beside him through the downpour, her arm steadying his. The journey back was slow, cold, and brutal, but she never faltered. By the time they reached the cabin, Luke was pale and shivering. Clara got him inside, stripped away his soaked clothes, and cleaned the wound on his leg. She worked until her hands ached, wrapping the bandage tight, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. When at last he stirred, eyes fluttering open, he saw her sitting by his side, drenched, exhausted but unshaken. "You came for me," he murmured. Her voice trembled. "You'd have done the same." Luke stared at her, something raw breaking through the walls he'd built for years. "You could have died out there." "So could you," she whispered, her fingers brushing his. "I wasn't going to lose you, too." For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the air was still. Luke reached for her hand and held it tightly, his thumb tracing the back of her palm. "I thought I'd buried everything good in me," he said softly. "But you keep bringing it back." Clara's tears came again, but this time they were quiet, full of warmth instead of fear. She leaned closer, her voice a whisper against the thunder. "Then let me keep doing that." And as the storm finally began to fade, Luke Tanner closed his eyes, not in pain or guilt, but in peace. For the first time in years, the storm had passed by morning, leaving the land washed clean and silent. The air smelled of wet pine and mud. The creek ran high and wild. But inside the small Tanner cabin it was warm, the fire steady, the air filled with the soft crackle of wood. Luke lay on the cot, his leg bandaged and propped, while Clara moved quietly about the room, checking the stew she'd made, adjusting the blanket that had slipped from his shoulder. He watched her from where he lay, the way she hummed softly to herself without realizing it, the gentle care in every movement. He'd seen plenty of women in his life, but none like her. There was no vanity in her, no pretense, just quiet strength. When she turned and caught him staring, She blushed and looked away. "You should eat," she said. "You need your strength." "I will," he murmured, voice rough. In a bit, she nodded, avoiding his eyes. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, a weight heavier than the storm had been. Finally, Luke cleared his throat. "Clara, sit a minute." She hesitated, then obeyed, folding her hands in her lap like a girl waiting for a scolding. "Yes?" He took a breath, his gaze fixed on the fire. "You asked me once why I don't talk much about the war. Or about before." Clara's eyes softened. "You don't have to—" "I do." He cut her off gently. "Because you deserve to know what kind of man you married." She said nothing, waiting. Luke's jaw tightened. "I wasn't a good one. I've done things I can't pray away, lost men I should have saved. My brother—" His voice caught. "He followed me into the cavalry. I told him we'd come home together. We didn't." The fire crackled. Outside, a bird called from the wet trees, the only sound in the silence that followed. Clara's fingers twisted in her lap. "That wasn't your fault." "It was," he said hoarsely. "He hesitated in a fight because he was watching me, making sure I was covered. I didn't see the man behind him. When I turned, it was too late." He exhaled, eyes closing. "Since that day, I stopped letting anyone close. Figured it was safer that way. For them." He looked at her then, raw and unguarded. "But then you came along, and every time I try to keep my distance, you just—" "Stay, no judgment. No pity, just you." Clara swallowed hard. "Because I see you," she whispered. "Not the stories they tell in town. Not the guilt you carry. You're a good man, Luke. You just forgot how to believe it." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Luke reached for her hand. His fingers were rough and warm around hers. "I don't know what you see in me, Clara Hayes Tanner, but I'm grateful." Her eyes glistened. "You don't have to know. You just have to trust it." Something in him broke loose then. A dam he'd built years ago around everything tender and human inside him. He sat up, wincing slightly, and reached out, brushing his thumb against her cheek. "You saved me," he murmured. "Out there in that storm, and here too." Clara's breath caught. "And you saved me long before that. The day you picked me when no one else even saw me standing there." He smiled. Small, real, a little broken. "Guess we're even then." She shook her head, tears spilling freely now. "No, not even close." And before either could speak again, she leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was slow, full of everything they'd held back. Pain, hope, forgiveness, and something that had quietly been growing since the day he'd pointed at her in that dusty street. When they finally parted, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "I reckon I love you, Clara," he whispered. Her answering smile trembled but shone like sunlight after rain. "Then reckon right, Mr. Tanner." Outside, the last clouds broke apart, and the first light of dawn spilled across the land, soft, golden, and new. A few weeks passed after the storm, and the days at the Tanner Ranch began to fall into a peaceful rhythm. The fields had recovered, the fences mended, and Luke's leg healed well enough for him to ride again. Clara tended the house, baked bread that filled the rooms with warmth, and laughed more than she ever had in her life. They were learning each other, in quiet ways. The shared looks across the table, the small touches that said what words couldn't. For the first time, Luke Tanner felt like a man at home, not just one passing through life. But peace has a way of being fragile, and that autumn, it shattered. It began with a rider on the horizon. Luke spotted him while working near the corral, a stranger with a black hat and a scar down his cheek, the kind of man who didn't ride into town for pleasantries. When the stranger dismounted, Luke's stomach turned cold. "Marshal Hayes," the man said, spitting dust from his mouth. "Heard you were living clean out here." Luke's jaw clenched. "You got the wrong man." The stranger grinned. "No, I don't. Luke Tanner, wanted in Abilene 3 years ago for desertion and theft. You left with a payroll meant for your company." Clara, who had stepped out onto the porch with a basket of washing, froze at the words. "Luke," she whispered, her face pale. Luke turned to her slowly, the truth catching in his throat. "It's not what he's saying, Clara. I didn't steal a thing." The man, Cole Avery, laughed. That's what they all say. I was there, Tanner. Saw you ride out in the night. Luke's fists tightened. And you saw me ride back with the wounded the next morning. You left before that. Cole's smile faded. Doesn't matter. There's a price on your head. He reached for his gun, but Luke was faster. He drew his revolver and held it steady. The two men stood there, wind whipping between them, silence stretched tight as wire. Clara's voice cut through it, trembling. Luke, stop, please. Luke didn't move. You need to leave, Cole. You've got it wrong and you don't want this fight. Cole spat again. You've got till sundown to come clean. If you don't, I'll bring the marshal myself. He mounted and rode off, leaving a trail of dust behind. For a long while, the only sound was the wind. Clara's hands trembled on the porch rail. Luke, she said finally, is it true? About the theft? He holstered his gun and turned to her, eyes dark with something heavy. I didn't steal that money, but I did leave. I walked away when they needed me most. Why? Because I thought my brother was dead, he said quietly. And I couldn't bear to watch more men die. I came back at sunrise with the wounded and the pay chest, but by then it was too late. The captain was gone. The report said I deserted. Clara stepped closer. Then why didn't you clear your name? He let out a bitter laugh. You think the army listens to a man like me? I came home to bury my brother and found a warrant waiting instead. Silence filled the space between them, thick with grief and shame. Clara reached out, her voice soft but steady. Then we'll face it, together. Luke shook his head. You don't know what you're saying. If they come for me, I do know, she said firmly. You stood for me when no one else did. I'm not letting you stand alone now. He stared at her. The woman the town had once mocked. The one he'd chosen without knowing why, and realized she was braver than anyone he'd ever met. That night, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long, Luke sat on the porch cleaning his rifle, watching the road for the dust of riders. The air felt heavy with reckoning. Inside, Clara lit a lamp and set it by the window, its glow a silent promise that no matter what came down that road, he wouldn't face it in the dark. The morning after Cole Avery's threat, the ranch felt different, too quiet, too still. The wind barely stirred the cottonwoods, and even the horses seemed uneasy. Luke Tanner sat at the kitchen table, staring at the rifle laid across it. The lamplight glinted off the steel, but his thoughts were far away, back in the war, in the mud and smoke, where everything he'd lost still haunted him. Clara moved softly around the room, packing a small satchel. You should eat something, she said gently, setting a plate in front of him. He didn't touch it. You should go to town. Stay with Mrs. Dobbins till this is done. She looked at him, really looked at him. You think I'd run now? This isn't your fight, Clara. Her voice trembled, but her chin lifted. It became mine the day you picked me in that square. I won't let them drag you away for something you didn't do. Luke's heart twisted. He'd faced bullets, storms, and ghosts, but nothing unnerved him like the fierce loyalty in her eyes. Just before noon, the sound of hooves echoed down the road, more than one rider. Luke rose, steadying himself. Through the window, he saw Cole Avery, and behind him, two men wearing marshals' badges. The law had come. They dismounted in silence. One of the marshals, a gray-haired man with tired eyes, stepped forward. Luke Tanner, you're under arrest for desertion and theft of government funds. Luke nodded slowly. You'll find your thief's name ain't mine, the marshal sighed. You can tell that to the judge in Abilene. Before Luke could speak, Clara stepped forward, skirts brushing the dirt, hands trembling, but eyes clear. Sir, she said, voice steady, before you take him, you should know the truth. The marshal frowned. And who might you be? His wife, she said simply. And the truth you're looking for is in a letter. From her apron pocket, she pulled a folded, weathered paper. Luke didn't know I found this, she said softly, handing it over. It was in his old chest, the one from the war. Luke's eyes widened. Clara, she met his gaze. You kept it because you couldn't forgive yourself. But it's time someone did. The marshal unfolded the paper. The ink had faded, but the signature at the bottom was clear. Captain J. Mercer, the same officer who'd commanded Luke's unit. The letter detailed what Luke had said all along. He'd returned with the payroll chest, rescued the wounded, and been falsely accused when the chaos of retreat scattered the company. The marshal read it twice, then looked up, jaw slack. This clears you. Why didn't you bring this forward? Luke stared at the ground. Because I thought it wouldn't matter. A tanner's word never counted for much. The older man's expression softened. Maybe it does now. Cole Avery shifted uncomfortably, his bravado draining away. Didn't know there was a letter, he muttered. Luke's eyes narrowed. No, you didn't care to know. The marshal handed the paper back and tipped his hat. You're a free man, Mr. Tanner, and a fool if you ever doubt a woman like that again. When they rode away, the silence that followed was thick, not with fear, but release. Luke turned to Clara, awe softening his face. You went through my chest? She smiled faintly. You'd have done the same if it meant saving me. He laughed, the sound rusty, unpracticed. Reckon I would have torn down the world to do it. He stepped closer, taking her face in his hands. You gave me back more than freedom, Clara. You gave me my name. Her voice trembled. You gave me a home. The wind stirred again, gentle this time, carrying the scent of rain and clean earth. For the first time in years, Luke Tanner felt light, as if the ghosts had finally laid down their burdens. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, the two of them sat on the porch, watching the horizon burn gold and rose. The world was quiet but alive, the way only the plains could be after a storm. Luke reached for her hand. I reckon folks'll still talk. Clara smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. Let them. We'll give them something worth talking about. And under that endless red rock sky, the rancher who'd once lived like a shadow and the shy woman everyone ignored finally found what they'd both been denied too long. Not just love, but peace. The kind that stays.